Hi, I'm going to read you some bedtime stories today, okay? Some fairy tales. So, let's start. The first one is called The Wild Swans. There once lived a king who had 11 sons and a beautiful daughter named Eliza. The 11 princes and the princess Eliza were very happy till their mother died. Then the king married a wicked woman who turned the 11 boys into wild swans. Eliza did not know what had become of them, and she wandered about, very sad of heart. One day, when she was on a little hill overlooking the ocean, she saw 11 swans flying toward her over the sea. Just as the sun went down, they dropped to the ground beside her. Their feathers fell off, and behold, there stood her 11 brothers. "Oh, now we can always be together," cried Eliza. But the oldest brother shook his head. "No," he said, "our wicked stepmother has bewitched us, and we must stay swans as long as the sun shines. But every night at sundown, we become men again. We do not live here, but far over the sea. Take me with you," pleaded the princess. So they made a great net of young willows and rushes. When morning came and they had become swans again, they took the net with their beaks and carried the girl away over the sea. Toward evening, a fearful storm arose with lightning and thunder, but just before sundown they reached a rock, and the brothers became men again. The lightning still flashed from the heavens, but the Princess Eliza was not afraid, for her brothers joined hands around the rock, and she felt quite safe. Next morning, her swan brothers carried her off to a beautiful country, and there she fell fast asleep. She dreamed that a fairy came to her and told her that she could break the spell if she made shirts of nettles and threw them over the swans. But she must not speak all the time she was at work. When she awoke, she remembered her dream and set to work. The nettles stung her poor hands, but she did not stop for that. When her brothers came that night, they saw her hands all blistered and asked her what had happened, but she said nothing. The next day, the king of that country caught sight of Eliza, and he fell in love with her at once and asked her to marry him. Eliza looked up into his kind face, but she said nothing. The king pitied her, for he thought she was dumb. Then he took her away to his palace, and there was a splendid wedding. But Eliza was not happy. She wandered into the woods and gathered nettles and worked upon the shirts. Then some of the people said she was a witch. But she worked on till she had 10 shirts finished, and the 11th almost completed. In those days, the people believed in witches, and it was not long until they cried out that the girl must die. So they carried her out and were just about to tie her to a post when 11 wild swans dropped down beneath her. All the people were frightened. Eliza broke through them, and catching up the 11 shirts, she threw them over the swans, and behold, her dear brothers stood beside her. "Tell the king I can speak now," cried Eliza. And when he had come, she told the story of why she had been silent so long. Then all the people praised her, and the king gave a great dinner party for her and the 11 princes, who were never to be swans again. Let's see. The next one. It's called The Nightingale. Many years ago, there was an emperor in China who lived in a splendid palace. He was very proud of his palace and was greatly pleased when travelers came from all over the world to see it. These travelers wrote many books about it, but they also wrote about a nightingale which sang beautifully in the forest nearby. The emperor had never heard of the nightingale until he read about it in a book. Then he called his servants. "Why has no one ever told me about this wonderful singing bird?" he said. "Bring it to me and let the bird sing for me this evening." But his men had never seen the bird, and no one in the court knew anything about it. At last, in the kitchen, they came upon a poor little girl, one of the lowest of the cooks, who said, "Oh, dear me, yes, I know the nightingale well. Oh, how she sings. The poor fishermen know her well, and every night, when I'm going through the forest to my mother's home, it sings for me very sweetly." Gladly the girl offered to take the king's servants to the forest, and hardly had they entered the woods when the nightingale began to sing. The men listened in wonder. Never before had they heard such music. "Little nightingale," the girl cried out quite loud, "our most gracious emperor wishes so much that you sing for him." "With great pleasure," answered the nightingale. So saying, the bird flew in front of them, and they all went back to the palace. The whole court was present, and even the little kitchen maid was permitted to stand by the emperor's chair. Then the nightingale hopped merrily upon a golden perch and began to sing. It sang so sweetly that great tears came into the emperor's eyes. "Stay with us, little nightingale," he cried, "and you shall have everything you wish." "I will stay," said the nightingale, "but I am paid enough. I have seen tears in the emperor's eyes." So it came to pass that the nightingale had a splendid cage and was given everything that she wished. One day came a package marked "The Nightingale," and when they opened it, they found a clockwork bird, covered with diamonds and precious stones. When it was wound up, it sang just like the real bird. Round its neck was a ribbon on which was written, "From the Emperor of Japan to the Emperor of China. "Oh, this is splendid," cried the ladies and gentlemen of the court. Even the emperor was delighted, and again the clockwork nightingale sang. The real nightingale stole away to the forest again. And you may imagine how glad the woodcutters and fishermen were when they heard the sweet song once more. 5 years passed away, when the whole land was thrown into deep grief by the emperor's sickness, and the doctors said he was close to death. As they leaned over the dying emperor, they heard him whisper, "Music, music, make the clockwork bird sing." But alas, something had gone wrong with the works of the clockwork bird, and no one could fix it. No one could make it sing. Then, when it seemed as if nothing could be done, there sounded the most delightful song. It was the little live nightingale. She had heard of the emperor's distress and had come to cheer him. As she sang, he felt his strength coming back, and clasping his hands together, he said, "Oh, nightingale, come back to us. I will break the clockwork bird just in pieces." "No, you must not do that," the nightingale said. "The poor little make-believe bird did as well as it could, so don't punish it." "And will you come back to your cage?" asked the emperor. "No," said the nightingale. "I must share my song with the poor woodcutters and the fishermen. But I will come every night and sing you one song, and you will grow strong and well. Now go to sleep and wake refreshed." The emperor fell into a deep sleep, so that his attendants thought he had indeed passed away. But in the morning, he opened his eyes, and looking around at the sorrowful people, he said, "Good morning." And then what a great rejoicing there was in the land, for the emperor was well and strong again. And every night the windows of the palace were thrown open wide to hear the lovely song of the nightingale. The real princess. There was once a prince who wished to marry a princess, but she must be a real princess. So he traveled about the whole world to find such a one, but everywhere there was something in the way. Princesses there were plenty, but whether they were real princesses, he could not be sure, for there was always something that did not seem quite right. So he came home again and was quite sad, for he wished so very much to have a real princess. One night, a terrific storm came on. It thundered and lightened, and the rain poured down dreadfully. There was then a knocking at the gate of the town, and the old king went to open it. It was a princess who stood outside at the gate, and, good heavens, what a state she was in! The water ran down from her hair and her clothes, in at the toes of her shoes and out at the heels. But she said she was a real princess. Well, that we will soon find out, the old queen thought. She said nothing, however, but went into the bedroom, and, having taken all the things of the bed, laid a small pea upon the slabs, upon which she heaped 20 mattresses, and then 20 eider-down quilts upon the mattresses. there the princess was to lie that night. In the morning she was asked how she had slept. "Oh, abominably badly," she answered. "I have scarcely closed my eyes the whole night. Heaven knows what there may have been in the bed, but I lay upon something hard, so that I am quite black and blue all over my body. It's quite dreadful." It was plain then that she was a real princess, since she had felt the pea through the 20 mattresses and the 20 eider-down quilts. No one could have so very fine a sense of feeling but a real princess. So the prince married her, for he knew that now he had a real princess, and the pea was placed in the Royal Museum, where it may still be seen if no one has taken it away. Now this is a true story. And the last one is called The Bell. In the evening at sunset, when golden clouds could just be seen among the chimney tops, a curious sound would be heard, first by one person, then by another. It was like a church bell, but it only lasted for a moment, because of the noise of carts and the street cries. "There's the evening bell," people would say. "The sun is setting." Those who went outside the town, where the houses were most scattered, each with its garden or little meadow, saw the evening star and heard the tones of the bell much better. It seemed as if the sound came from a church buried in silent, fragrant woods, and people looked that way, feeling quite peaceful. Time passed, and still people said one to the other, "Can there be a church in the woods? That bell has such a wonderfully sweet sound. Shall we go and look at it closer?" The rich people drove, and the poor ones walked, but it was a very long way. When they reached a group of willows which grew on the edge of the wood, they sat down and looked up among the long branches, thinking that they were really in the heart of the forest. A candy man from the town came out and pitched a tent there, and then another candy man, and he hung a bell up over his tent. This bell was tarred so as to stand the rain, and it had no clapper. When people went home again, they said it had been so pretty, and that meant something more than mere tea. 3 people said that they had walked right through the forest to the other side, and that they had heard the same curious bell all the time, but that then it sounded as if it came from the town. One of them wrote a poem about it, and said that it sounded like a mother's voice to a beloved child. No melody could be sweeter than the chimes of this bell. The emperor was told about it, and he promised that anyone who really found where the sound came from should have the title of the world's bell ringer, even if there was no bell at all. A great many went to the woods to earn an honest penny, but only one of them brought home any kind of news. No one had been far enough, not even he himself, but he said that the sound of the bell came from a very big owl in the hollow tree. It was a wise owl, which kept on beating its head against the tree, but whether the sound came from its head or from the hollow tree, he could not say. All the same, he was appointed world's bell ringer, and every year he wrote a little paper about the owl, but nobody was much wiser for it. Now, on a Sunday, the priest had preached a very moving sermon. All the young people had been much touched by it. It was a beautiful sunny day, and after church, the young people walked out of the town, and they heard the sound of the unknown bell, more than usually loud, coming from the wood. On hearing it, they all felt anxious to go further and see it, all but 3. The first of these had to go home to try on her ball dress. The second was a poor boy who had borrowed his coat and boots of the landlord's son, and he had to carry them back before night. The third said that he had never been anywhere without his mother, that he had always been a good child, and he meant to keep on so. So these three did not go. The others trudged off. The sun shone, and the birds sang, and the young people took each other by the hand and sang with them. Soon, two of the smallest ones got tired, and they went back to town. Two little girls sat down and made wreaths, so they could not go either. When the others got to the old willows where the Candyman had their tents, they said, "Now then, here we are. There is not any bell. It is only something people imagine." Just then a bell was heard in the wood, with its deep, rich notes, and 4 or 5 of them decided after all to go further into the wood. The underwood was so thick and close that it was hard to walk. The bushes grew almost too high, and brambles hung in long garlands from tree to tree, where the nightingales sang and the sunbeams played. It was lovely and peaceful, but there was no path for the girls. Their clothes would have been torn to shreds. There were great boulders overgrown with many-colored mosses, and fresh springs trickled among them with a curious little gurgling sound. "Surely that cannot be the bell," said one of the younger people as he lay down to listen. "I must look into this." So he stayed behind and let the others go on. They came to a little hut made of bark and branches, overhung by a crab-apple tree, as if it wanted to shake all its bloom over the roof, which was covered with roses. The long sprays clustered round the gable, and on it hung a little bell. Could this be the one they sought? Yes, they were all agreed that it must be, except one. He said it was far too small and delicate to be heard so far away, as they had all heard it, and that the tones which moved all hearts were quite different from these. He who spoke was a king's son, and so the others said, "That kind of fellow must always be wiser than anyone else." So they let him go alone, and as he went, he still heard the little bell with which the others were so pleased, and now and then, when the wind came from the direction of the Candyman, he could hear the children calling for tea. But the deep-toned bell sounded above them all, and it seemed as if there was an organ playing with it, and the sounds came from the left, where the heart is placed. There was a rustling among the bushes, and a little boy stood before the king's son. He had wooden shoes on, and such a small jacket that the sleeves did not cover his wrists. They knew each other, for he was the boy who had to go back with the coat and the boots to the landlord's son. He had done this, changed back into his shabby clothes and wooden shoes, and then, drawn by the deep notes of the bell, had come to the wood again. "Then we can go together," said the king's son, but the poor boy in the wooden shoes was too bashful. He pulled down his short sleeves and said he was afraid he could not walk quickly enough, besides which he thought the bell ought to be looked for on the right, because that side looked the most beautiful. "Then we shan't meet at all," said the king's son, nodding to the poor boy, who went into the thickest and darkest parts of the wood, where the thorns tore his shabby clothes and scratched his face, hands, and feet till they bled. The king's son got some good scratches too, but he at least had the sun shining upon his path. "We are going to follow him, for he is a bright fellow. I must and will find the bell," he said, "if I have to go to the end of the world. Some horrid monkeys sit up in the trees, grinning and showing their teeth. Shall we throw nuts at him?" said they. "Shall we thrash him? He's a king's son." But he went bravely on further and further into the wood, where the most beautiful flowers grew. There were white star-like lilies, with red hearts, pale blue tulips, which glistened in the sun, and apple trees, on which the apples looked like great shining soap bubbles. You may fancy how these trees glittered in the sun. Round about were beautiful green meadows, where deer played under the spreading oaks and beeches. There were also great quiet lakes, where white swans swam about flapping their wings. The king's son often stopped and listened, for he sometimes fancied that the bell sounded from one of these lakes. But then again, he felt sure that it was not there, but further into the wood. Now the sun began to go down, and the clouds were fiery red. A great stillness came over the wood, and he sang upon his knees, sang his evening psalm, and said, "Never shall I find what I seek. Now the sun is going down. The night is coming on, the dark night. Perhaps I could catch one more glimpse of the round red sun before it sinks beneath the earth. I will climb up on those rocks. They are as high as the trees." He seized the roots and creepers and climbed up the slippery stones where the water snakes wriggled and the toads seemed to croak at him. But he got to the top before the sun disappeared. Seen from this height, oh, what splendor lay before him! The ocean, the white, beautiful ocean, its long waves rolling towards the shore. The sun still stood like a great shining altar, out there where sea and sky met. Everything melted away into glowing colors. The wood sang, the ocean sang, and his heart sang with him. All nature was like a great holy church, where trees and floating clouds were the pillars, flowers and grass the woven carpet, and the heaven itself a great dome. The red colors faded as the sun went down, but millions of stars peeped out. They were like many diamond lamps, and the king's son spread out his arms towards heaven, sea, and wood. And at that moment, from the right-hand path came the poor boy with the short sleeves and wooden shoes. He had reached the same goal just as soon by his own road. They ran toward each other and clasped each other's hands in that great church, and above them sounded the unseen holy bell. I hope you enjoyed these fairy tales. Sleep well.